Ironically, if you're in the sales answer question, you probably have to be asking some work-related stuff. The opposite is true when you're in a work context. So you're going to that professional networking mixer, right? Stop asking questions like, so what do you do? Because you're going to naturally have the conversation gravitate towards work anyway. You're in a work function. So deliberately push it to other areas so you can get to know them from a couple other dimensions and find a couple other reasons to connect. I mean, humans are incredibly complicated beings, right? You know that there's so many different facets to you and that you really appreciate when someone takes the time to understand all of the different facets of you. Well, that same thing applies to every other human here too. And the research supports it, that we grow deeper connections faster with people for whom there are multiplex ties. So we've got to stop thinking of categorizing people in certain buckets. And then we've also got to stop thinking when we meet those new people that there's only one context in which they can be useful to them. We're not even at the useful stage. We're just focused on connections. And it's better to make as many different contexts for connection as we can so we can build those multiplex ties.
Welcome to the TalentGrow Show, where you can get actionable, results-oriented insight and advice on how to take your leadership, communication, and people skills to the next level and become the kind of leader people want to follow. And now, your host and leadership development strategist, Halelly Azulay.
Hey, welcome back, Talent Growers, to another episode of the TalentGrow Show. I'm Halelly Azulay, your leadership development strategist here at TalentGrow, and I'm really excited about this week's episode. It's David Burkus. He is a guy who's focused on leadership and networking and a lot of things we have in common. And this show in particular is about his new book that comes out exactly today, if you're listening to this as this show drops. And it's called Friend of a Friend. We talk about the whole idea of networking as something that is not an activity that you do, but actually a mindset of how you think about the network that you're embedded in. And we talk about big words like homophily and multiplexity. You will learn what those are and why you should care. And definitely we think about it from the perspective of leaders. What should leaders know about networking based on the science of network science, which is a thing. So I can't wait for you to listen. It's super actionable and I enjoyed this conversation and I hope that you will too. Hey, Talent Growers, welcome back. I have David Burkus on with me. He's a best-selling author, a sought-after speaker, and associate professor of leadership and innovation at Oral Roberts University. And he has a brand new book that's out today, if you're listening to this show as it's released. So very excited for you to read his new book. I've really enjoyed reading it. It's called Friend of a Friend, and it offers readers a new perspective on how to grow their networks and build key connections, ones based on the science of human behavior, not rote networking advice. So totally up my alley. He's delivered keynotes to the leaders of Fortune 500 companies and the future leaders of the United States Naval Academy. And his TED Talk, his previous TED Talk, has been viewed over 1.8 million times. He's a regular contributor to Harvard Business Review, and he actually has a brand new TEDx talk that you should check out related to this new book. Welcome, David.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. Yeah, I guess I should probably stop talking about the old talk and start talking about the new one.
Well,
good
I'm
call.
sure. Yeah, well,
behind.
you know,
it's already. The book's already out, and I'm already behind. But
that's cool. Well, you know, maybe it takes a while to amass another 1.8 million views. So I would say that's a pretty good statistic to have in your bio. I don't blame you for having it in there.
Love it.
One I'm having envious of, but you know, everybody has their own thing. So very cool. I'm looking forward to talking with you more about this topic. My listeners know that I love to talk about networking because I say that I'm a born again networker. I've seen the light. But before we do, I always ask my guests to describe their professional journey very briefly. Where did you get started? How did you get to where you are today?
If you ask my 6-year-old son, he'll tell you that I make books, I give talks, and I take care of him, which is really true. I've been super blessed to be able to do that. So I look at my journey as my goal is to kind of combine you say you were born again networker. I say I'm a recovering academic. This is actually kind of funny. My goal is to kind of connect those two worlds, the ivory tower and the corner office, and find the insights from research that are useful to people who actually need to put those things into practice, translate it out of academic jargon into practical application. And I've been really blessed that I've built an audience through that. So now with 3 books, been able to have that as the unifying theme through all of them. So that's really been the goal from the get-go. And it's really fun that we're finally getting some traction with it.
Yeah, very cool. And your first books were about creativity and leadership. So this is an interesting development.
Oh, the networking one? Yeah. It really comes from really just wanting to study network science deeper and then wondering like, why doesn't everybody know this? Like there's a couple things in the book that are in a lot of other networking advice books, but most of it is, I'm not seeing this anywhere. So clearly networkers need this. So let's write that book.
At And what do you expect to be the biggest impact? Like what was the main thing you were hoping to achieve with it?
So I really hope that at the core of this book is the idea that we need to think differently about when we even use the term networking. Like a network isn't something you have. It's not a collection of contacts on your phone. Networking's not even something you do in terms of like, we tend to define networking as going to that networking event, right?
Yes.
I think the best approach is that you exist inside a network. I mean, we all exist in one network, 7.4 billion strong and counting, but in your sort of professional life, there's a smaller network that it's not yours. You just exist inside of it, and you need to figure out how it works, how it operates, who's connected to who. You need to get the map and then navigate that network accordingly. That's the most effective approach to take rather than just collecting contacts on your phone or on LinkedIn.
Yeah. And for our listeners who are leaders, what do you think is the specific value that they can gain from thinking about this? A lot of times I find personally in my work that people tend to think about networking either if they have something to sell, so if they're in a sales role or a marketing role, or if they're an entrepreneur, right? If they have a side hustle or something like this, and a lot of times when people are not in any of those roles, and this was true for me before I was born again, I was just sort of focused on like, let me just do my job, do a good job, and then I'll be noticed. And a lot of people that maybe are, within an organization and doing a good job and getting promoted, they're leaders, they're not thinking that networking is a thing that they should even think about. So what do you think is a really important message that you've got in this book for them?
Yeah. So, I mean, you're exactly right. Most people think when they think of the reason for networking, it's either like, I need a new job, I need to make a sale, or I have this side hustle or startup thing that I need to make working. The truth is, in all three of those categories, the value that a network provides is the same, and it's information. And that doesn't change when you're in a leadership role. Now you have information where you're making decisions where multiple people's lives, not just your own, depend on you making that right decision. And so it's even more incumbent to be making sure that you're getting as accurate and as valid and also as diverse a set of information as possible to make those decisions. So ultimately, you have to kind of take responsibility, not only for your own network, but for the network of the people that you lead, that you manage, so that you're all getting accurate enough information to do your jobs appropriately. And then, of course, if your goals are even more upwardly ambitious, the good news and bad news is it really is who you know. It's bad news if you don't know that many people, but it's good news because you have control over that. And so you become that sort of born again networker. You begin to realize that who you know is something entirely within your control.
Yeah, totally. And of course, one of the things that I will link to in the show notes, there's a lot of ways to go about that, the right ways and the wrong ways about how you want to approach people when you want to become a born again networker. But we'll leave that for another day. So, in your book and also in the new TED Talk, which I'll link to because I enjoyed watching it, one of the biggest messages you have, which I don't know that we're going to talk about as much today because there's a couple of hidden messages that I think people aren't hearing that much. It's the idea that there's people that you're immediately connected with, and then there's people that are in your network that are more distant ties or, kind of connections that you've allowed to go cold, and that there's tons of juice and value in those. In the research, as you mentioned in your book, it's called dormant ties. But there's something that you talk about in your book that I don't hear a lot about, which is the term homophily. I would love for you, and I think you just mentioned how information is one of those benefits for networking, and this seems to me really related. So let's talk about that. What does it mean, and why do you think we should resist it?
You're exactly right. From an information standpoint, this is key. And really, I think this is probably the biggest lesson from network science specifically for leaders. I mean, the things we talk about with weak ties and friend of a friend connections, et cetera, are hugely important, all because they sort of service that information piece. But homophily is a really interesting one. So homophily translates literally to love of same. And it brings its roots back to that whole idea of like attracts like. And, there are certain people that look like you, act like you, think like you're more likely to click with them, et cetera. And for the longest time, we thought that most of the lack of diversity in someone's network was driven by this pull of homophily, just people not wanting to interact with a diverse set of people. And interestingly, that's true, but it's not the dominant factor. So what happens when we look at network science and studies of how diverse people's networks are is there's sort of a downward spiral of homophily. So it starts with an initial we click with people that are already like us, with people that do our same job or have our same background, etc. But over time, what happens is that networks also serve you new introductions, right? Your friends introduce you to friends of friends, et cetera. And if your network from the get-go isn't diverse enough, what happens is the likelihood that you're then going to get more diverse connections served to you from that network goes down. Right. So over time, the less diverse a network you have sort of spirals out of control, because if everybody looks alike, acts alike, thinks alike, has the same job, then everybody they know looks alike, thinks alike, acts alike, has the same job. So homophily, this problem of lack of diversity, is actually a network problem, not necessarily just an openness to getting to know diverse people, getting diverse sources of information. You can overcome the initial pull of homophily and still find yourself in a network where everyone you know or could meet is already too similar to you. And so the lesson is that you have to take sort of deliberate actions to go outside of that. Sometimes that's finding that one person that has the right level of diversity and using them as a structural whole to bridge you over to communities that you're not connected to. And other times it means doing the hard work of actually going and being a total stranger yourself to a new community so that you can break out of that downward spiral and move forward. But you're exactly right that this all services the information piece. I mean, the best term I hear for this is Ronald Burt, one of the sociologists we feature prominently in the book, uses the term redundancy for any time somebody has all the same connections, thinks alike, acts alike, et cetera. And I love that term because it's literally like, as a leader, if everybody that's speaking into you and giving counsel to you also thinks like you, then those people are redundant. What you need are people who are not redundant. And homophily is sort of the warning that your network isn't going to serve them naturally. You need to be doing sort of deliberate effort to make sure that you're going out and making those new connections.
And in your book, I love how you end every chapter with really actionable advice, both things to do in person and also things to do online. I appreciate that. And one of the things that I also teach people to do in this situation is to think about, well, who are the people that you're most connected with? Who are the people that you lean on the most for information and connections? And do they have a very similar role to you? Are they in the same industry? Do they see things from the same perspective? Because that's your sign that you've got homophily as a problem. And then how do you diversify the inputs that you get, right? And your ability to see things from different perspectives, which of course allows you to bring more value to your network, because you're going to be one of those, as Bert says, brokers. You can be one of those people who carry information and ideas from other networks into yours. And so share specific techniques that you teach about how to overcome this, because you just said, you need to take that risky step of going to some place where, no one is like you. And that is both it sounds kind of like general and completely scary.
Well, it is completely scary for a lot of people. I mean, the biggest thing is first we have to figure out if there's a problem. And you kind of hinted at this earlier, that you've got to sort of audit your network, right? And figure out, okay, the people that are closest to you, how similar to you are these? So I in the book, I encourage people to basically make a list, like who are the most frequent interactions you've had in a given week or a given month. So you can use, email, look at your sent messages, you can look at your call records, whatever, and just put up, who are the, let's say 15 people that I interacted with the most this past week. And then write out, like, that's like column one, and then write out a couple other columns for what matters for you in your career, right? So it might be job function, it might be age, it might be background, it might be political ideology, whatever it is that's most important for you to break out of this homophily piece and go for diversity. Write those out and then do an audit and go sort of find that information. And, the most interesting thing is we tend to assume that most of the world thinks and acts like us, even though they don't. So in doing this audit, you're deliberately seeking it out. You're probably actually going to find a couple people in your network that actually don't think like you. You just assume they do, which is those people are actually valuable because they provide you that diversity kind of already, but be ready for a little uncomfortable shock there. And then the other thing is really look at it. Now, I'm not saying that you need to ignore people that work in the same field as you. You need that sort of community of practice, but you don't need it to be all 15 people. You need it to be half or less. You do need trusted people that are similar to you so that they can kind of give you a little bit of counsel, but they can't be your only source of information. Then you have a problem. right? So if then you have a problem, then we get into how do you go meet those new connections? And this is where, I actually sort of misspoke. The sort of networking mixer where you go out and meet new people that everybody assumes, it's actually not all that effective of this, because we go back to that pull, love of same. So the best thing to do is actually start diving into what in the research we actually call shared activities, things where there's a diverse set of people that are drawn to it. There is an activity or a goal or an objective that is bigger than just meeting new people. So this could be everything from volunteering for a nonprofit to like a pickup softball league, right? As long as there's something at stake that's different than just connecting with other people. And the interesting thing is we find that we make better connections to people, and we make better connections to more diverse people when you're not focused on it. When you're focused on that shared activity, you end up alongside people to your right and left who are different from you. And then you build a stronger connection to them through that activity. It's a far more valuable time than like, oh, my network's not diverse enough, I'm going to go to a networking event.
Yeah. And let's see, because my ethnicity is that I am a Latino, I will go to an Asian networking event. There, I'm done.
No, I mean, yeah, exactly. And it needs to be a whole lot deeper than that. And, it needs to be actually, I'm thinking about this from an ethics standpoint. I was talking to never made it into the book, but I was talking to one person who moved to Sweden, I think, and wanted to make sure that like, okay, from work, she knows lots of those people, but I want to know the expats from like lots of other places. So she started taking salsa dancing lessons, right? Because that's kind of a thing that will draw out sort of expats, people from Hispanic communities originally, but also people with an interest in it. And then she moved from that to square dancing, because supposedly that gets all the Americans. I don't know, that's a huge stereotype, but but it was this idea of like deliberately picking the activities because they were not anti-Swedish, but they were definitely not what that culture normally did, right? So if you want to think about it from the standpoint of I need to deliberately meet a certain group of people, yes, but go to the activities that group of people do. Don't just go to I'm going to go to a Latino networking event because that's going to work. It's not. It still has the fundamental problem of being an event where the whole purpose is to connect with other people. All of the research supports the idea that we don't actually connect all that well.
Yeah. And it's such a shallow, I mean, it's fine as part of a more robust and holistic networking approach. There's nothing wrong with going to events here and there, but so many people equate networking with an event, and it's totally not that. So I love that you recommend people get involved. And I think that for most people, when you get involved with some kind of an extracurricular activity, or, you volunteer, you do something on the side, there's usually some common interest. So if you think about like those Venn diagram circles, I mean, there's some overlap of something of an interest you have in common with these other people, but then you're probably very different from them in all of these other areas. And that's where the value is of sort of mixing up your inputs. And this, I think, also is a good connection to another concept that you bring up in your book, which is called multiplexity. Another big word that we must define before continuing. But I think that these kinds of activities rather than events also help with that, don't they?
Yeah, it's weird, right? It's almost like I did that on purpose. No, I mean, it's actually
I'm sure you did.
It's the way network science works, right? All of these concepts are sort of related. So real briefly, multiplexity refers to the number of ties or number of reasons for connection that you have to someone. So if you only have a work connection, let's say, to someone, it's the only context in which you know that person, you have a uniplex tie to them. Right? But if you work together and your kids go to the same school, then that's two ties, right? That you work together, your kids go to the same school, and you both love soccer, right, or football, depending on where you're listening to this. That's a third tie, right? And the research says that the more context, the more ties that we can use to connect people, the deeper a relationship we'll get with them faster. Why is this so important? Well, most of us sort of are trained, even at those networking mixers, et cetera, to stick in one sort of bucket, right? We put people in certain buckets. So we met them in salsa dancing class. They're our salsa dancing friend, and we might not inquire much more beyond that. Well, you're not going to build a deep connection to them faster. You have to be asking, ironically, if you're in the salsa dancing question, you probably have to be asking some work-related stuff. The opposite is true when you're in a work context. So you're going to that professional networking mixer, right? Stop asking questions like, so what do you do? Because you're going to naturally have the conversation gravitate towards work anyway. You're in a work function. So deliberately push it to other areas so you can get to know them from a couple other dimensions and find a couple other reasons to connect. I mean, you know this because this is true about you. And then we don't tend to think about it as other people. Humans are incredibly complicated beings, right? You know that there's so many different different facets to you, and that you really appreciate when someone takes the time to understand all of the different facets of you. Well, that same thing applies to every other human here too. And the research supports it, that we grow deeper connections faster with people for whom there are multiplex ties. So we've got to stop thinking of categorizing people in certain buckets. And then we've also got to stop thinking when we meet those new people that there's only one context in which they can be useful to them. We're not even at the useful stage. We're just focused on connections. And it's better to make as many different contexts for connection as we can so we can build those multiplex ties.
I totally agree. And I think it also makes life much more enjoyable. What do you think are some of the other kinds of maybe unknown benefits to multiplex ties?
So, the thing that's really interesting when you start breaking out of these buckets is how useful work friends can be to you in a real world scenario. Not to separate work from real world, that's kind of awkward, but you know what I mean? Well, work versus personal life scenario. Yes. But also personal life from a work scenario. So in the book, we talk about Whitney Johnson, who's a dear friend of mine, a brilliant thinker, who got her start in working in investment banking and eventually became an institutional sort of analyst. And then ended up working for a hedge fund with Clay Christensen, not because Clay was familiar with all of her investment analyst work, et cetera, but because they went to church together and they served on a committee, a volunteer committee together. And because of that connection, Clay was smart enough to think, well, it's not just about who I know in the context of in the investment world, it's who I know in the context of everyone in my world. And then, a couple personal connections also have a shared work context. Maybe I should reach out to them too, not just the people I know inside that sort of work bucket. So there's all sorts of opportunities that are in that. But again, that only happens if you're willing to kind of look at other people as multidimensional. You'll see that ways that they can help you in multi-dimensions, but more importantly, probably ways you can help them in ways they don't even expect, because they might be putting you in one bucket instead of seeing you as multidimensional.
Yeah, because networking is actually the process of building and maintaining mutually beneficial long-term relationships. So it is never transactional, and you should always seek ways for you to give first and often, because then when you need a favor, people are just chomping at the bit to help you because you've helped them so much. So that's
exactly right. I like to call that being a decent human being.
Kind of seems obvious.
But right. But honestly, some people aren't born again networkers. They're just networkers. Yeah. And so they don't see that. And the principle is still the same. Like, I really love to go back to Ronald Burt. He wasn't the one who coined this term, but popularized this term social capital, which takes, it's a little sleaze bag because it takes all of these human dimensions and puts them into a capital instrumental sort of way. But if it's capital, it also obeys the principle of investment, which means the more you put into it, the more you invest it, the more you'll have over time to withdraw. So if you want to be that person that just makes networking about transactions, you're still better off giving and putting lots of value into the network before you extract it.
Yeah. And use the trader principle. So I liked also that in the book, you shared the story of two guys that are doing this in an interesting way. I'd love to maybe share this with listeners. Jason Gaynard, who does Mastermind Dinners, and John Levy, who does, I think he calls them influencer dinners, right?
Yeah. So there's actually three in the book. So we've got, the idea was we've got people at sort of all spectrums of this growth curve, right? So you have Jason Gaynard, who runs an amazing event called Mastermind Talks.
Yeah.
That was an outgrowth of these Mastermind Dinners that he wanted to put on. And essentially the story is that Jason realized had a company that was thriving. Some changes in the credit industry happened that sort of left him basically bankrupt. And he realized that in trying to grow his business, he had basically ignored most of his relationships. So as he's trying to sort of grow them back, he starts with these, what he calls Mastermind Dinners, the idea of getting people together over a little bit different meeting. It's not lunch, right? It's not a networking mixer. It's a longer thing where you can kind of get to know people on a multidimensional level. Has grown his network into the point where he's at the point where he's actually more worried about pruning people, or I like to not call it pruning, but giving permission for someone to be a weak tie instead of a close knit tie, right? And then you've got John Levy, who's been running his influencers dinner for a really long time. And John and another gentleman, Chris Shembra. Chris is a little bit newer into this dinner game. And if you haven't figured it out, like, dinners are like the secret weapon of networking. But what both of them have in common is that their dinners are participatory. So in Chris's case, there is an assigned task. He has the same meal every single time. And so he knows what he needs 12 different people to do. And so you come to the dinner. And starting at 7:47, he calls his dinner 7:47 club dinners, because that's how long it takes to cook 2 boxes of pasta if he wants to eat at 8. And he knows in that 13 minutes, we have all of these different tasks that need to get done. So he assigns them all out. John's takes a little bit different approach, where he's got a couple different menus, different things. But the coolest thing about John's dinners is there's basically 2 rules. You're going to get paired up with someone to cook your own dinner, and you're not allowed to use your name or talk about what you do as a job. So you are sharing an activity, right, where there's something at stake, which is building this dinner together. And then you're not allowed to talk about a work context yet. So it keeps you from sort of having that script that we all kind of fall back on, and forces you to find multiplex reasons to connect with people. So you end up, like we were saying earlier with shared activities, building a deeper relationship faster, because there's a couple different dimensions you're connecting to. And you're connecting to people who, if you were just sticking to that what do you do script, you probably would have written off 10 minutes into the conversation. But you're connecting on a deeper level, and you never know where it's going to go. As we prove with multiplexity, you can't put people in buckets, because you never know who's going to be able to help you and who you're going to be able to help. So these dinners, all 3 people, these dinners leverage these principles of sharing an activity, seeing somebody for more than just that professional connection, and building a multiplex tie to them.
Yeah. And I really love that you shared that. And I wanted listeners to think about this, because it also introduces, and by the way, these guys are also very thoughtful about how they pair people up, or, I know Jason thinks about how he seats people around the table to create that maximum multiplexity effect, but also give people what he knows might be a point of commonality or some common interest, or something that he knows can spark an interesting conversation and true connections. But I wanted everyone to listen to this, because sometimes we think to ourselves, well, I don't know, what to do, or I don't know where to go to meet different people. And you can think about being the creator. If you can't find something someone else created, it's not that hard, and you can be creative and find a way for you. And that allows you to add value to everyone else, well beyond the value that you also receive from attending these.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is, like, there's 7.4 billion people in the world. Like, okay, you are special and you're unique, but you're not that special. And so if you can't find a group that is the group you need to join to get those things for you, the odds that there are other people who are in your similar role that are begging for this type of group are pretty high. There's 7.4 billion people in the world. So it's probably that initial indication of, like, I don't know where to start because there's not a group for me. That's a pretty strong indication that, like, there's a market need, there's a lack, and you're the one that's going to meet it.
Yeah, love it. All right. Well, hopefully everyone listening has gotten tons of value already, and will go and buy your book. We'll link to it in the show notes. Before we wrap up, and before you share that one specific action, asking someone who is in the throes of a book launch what's new and exciting in your horizon is a little bit potentially of a cyclical question. Are you able to even think about anything beyond this at this moment?
Yeah. So, I mean, I feel like, we're on day 1 of the campaign trail, right? And so we're hitting like the pancake breakfast up in Iowa. But we're saying the same message for a really long time. On the other hand, we do have, I have a couple different ideas for what projects and things we want to do. I really enjoyed the communities piece, like we just talked about over dinners. And there's another piece of the book where I talk about silos actually possibly being a good thing, so long as you don't stay in them too long. And so that's probably where my curiosity is going to head once we get out of this message. I don't know if that'll turn into a book or an extension on Friend of a Friend or a course, or what it's going to turn into. But that's kind of that's the studies and the anecdotes that I've been throwing in Evernote a lot recently to look at later when we come up for air from this book launch. So there's probably something there. I don't know that I want to call it a project, but that's probably the hint, is how much are we influenced by the people around us, and then how important is it to make sure so we select those people properly for whatever life it is we want to live.
Kind of like that you become the average of the 5 people that you surround yourself with thing.
Right. No, exactly. And you know, because you read Friend of a Friend already, that it's actually far more than just the 5 people, right? It's also like their friends and their friends of friends, right, and all of that kind of a thing. And the lesson for that is that we probably need to be way more deliberate about the communities that we're a part of, and how they reinforce habits and all of that sort of stuff. So that's probably where we're headed. Interesting.
Oh, I can't wait to hear more about that. Very cool.
Well, whatever project it turns into, I will email you about it, and we can talk about it at length whenever it's ready.
Okay, deal.
Cool.
I would love it. So we always like to end on something super actionable. What's something that listeners can do today, tomorrow, this week to ratchet up their own success and effectiveness, either as a leader or in general in their careers.
So I want to encourage you, if you're listening, we know multiplexity is important. We know we need to resist the pull of homophily. So here's the big kind of thing, which is break out of that habit of the "so what do you do" question. So it's not a go do this right away, but your trigger is when you meet a new person. When you meet a new person in any time in the next couple of weeks, what I want you to do is ask a different question. I can give you lists of questions, everything from, where did you grow up? What's your favorite hobby? Who's your favorite superhero, which is a personal favorite of mine? What charitable cause are you most passionate about? But ask a different question. And if you can't think of any other thing, ask your question that you just asked me. What's new and exciting?
Yes, that's one of my favorite questions.
Most
that's
people
funny.
won't say their specific job function. They'll say something else they're more proud of and want to disclose to you, and you'll end up getting to know that person far deeper than if you know, oh, you're an analyst at Smith Barney. Great, right? Ask that question instead. Make that introduction the trigger event, and make the new habit asking a different question than, so what do you do?
Love it. And if you want to send in your questions and how they work, like what question do you like using and why, or what did you try and did it work or not? I would love to hear that. You put that in the show notes comments section or Twitter or, someplace. And I'm sure David and I will both enjoy learning about what you tried and how it worked. Well, David, it's been a pleasure having you on the TalentGrow Show. We really appreciate your insights. And how can people learn more and get more of that juicy, interesting information from you?
Yeah. So, obviously, I hope you check out the book, Friend of a Friend. It's available in every good bookstore. If it's not available, it's because you're not at a good bookstore. But if you're listening to this, you listen all the way through, you're part of a very exclusive group of TalentGrow Show fans. You are part of the End of the Podcast Club, right? Which is a very elite club of people who listen to me blather on for 30 minutes. And I want to give you a thank you for listening to that. So the best place to connect with me is you go to davidburkus.com/TalentGrow Show. We've got a special, I call it an audio course. Think of it like a collection of a couple different podcasts that'll teach you, based on these network science principles, how to give the introductions that you need to give, how to get or feel out and figure out who the people you need to connect with are, and even how to introduce yourself better in line with all of these principles. So that's the How to Connect course. Yours totally free for being part of the End of the Podcast Club. davidburkus.com/TalentGrow Show.
Love it. And I love that new term. I might steal it. Very cool. Well, thanks again. And good luck with the book. And let's stay in touch.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you again so much for having me.
It's absolutely my pleasure. We now have a new club name, right? The End of the Show Club. Is that what he was calling it? I hope that you'll take action as David suggested, and that you will also take my challenge, which is to share in the show notes comments or on social media, what were some of those questions that you tried and how did it work out for you? I'd love to know. I'm very curious. And I really would love to support you even better by knowing more about what it is that you want to learn about, what you're struggling with in your leadership development journey, so that I can craft more shows that help answer your questions and your needs even more specifically. So definitely drop me a line and let me know. That would be so awesome. I'm Halelly Azulay, your leadership development strategist here at TalentGrow, and you've been listening to the TalentGrow Show. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you listening. And until the next time, make today great.
Thanks for listening to the TalentGrow Show, where we help you develop your talent to become the kind of leader that people want to follow. For more information, visit talentgrow.com.